saving system settings and game progress on the memory card.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Saving Progress, where we hope to learn a little bit more about our personal history with video games. I am your host, Addy, and this week's episode, as you can probably tell, is a little bit interesting. This episode marks 6 whole months of the Saving Progress podcast, and I think that's something really special. We're halfway through the better part of a year now, as this show started back in November of 2021, and it's only a matter of time until the show reaches its first ever anniversary. You know, it feels like it hasn't really been that long, but here we are, talking about it all in the past tense, nonetheless. So, for those of you watching this on YouTube, which, as of recording this episode, is all of you, you've noticed that the video has a bit of a different vibe going on. Things are changing, the camera's panned over to a different landscape, trouble is brewing in the air, people are going missing, and not really, I'm just kidding about that last part. Could you imagine if the podcast... But what I do have for you today is a new addition to the series that I've decided to call Saving Progress Dark Mode. And this is just a small riff on the formula where we can turn down the lights and have a one-on-one chat. You know, this time it's just me, no guest, no interview. I'm talking to no one else except myself and you, the viewer. And this is not a separate series, this is still considered Saving Progress. As you can see, the episode is still labeled as episode 6 in the title, so hopefully these episodes won't feel too much different from the main show, but now I'm willing to bet you're thinking to yourself, what exactly is different about Dark Mode and why should I care? Well, basically, what the idea was for this is to have 1 or 2 episodes per year where I set myself up with a topic related to games and the gaming industry, and to go into detail about those topics and my thoughts on them in order to open up discussion in the comments. You know, they ideally aren't going to be about any specific game series or franchises, rather, they're going to be topics that address video games as a whole. And it can be about the industry, it can be about morals, questions, recurring themes, and controversies, you know, basically in the same vein as a fully edited video essay, but more off the cuff, so to speak. Outside of that, I want to use this as a way to sort of take a step back and have myself talk about the history of the show and the channel and how far it's come, sort of like a look back on any milestones, so to speak, as well as anything that I have in store for the future as well. And not going to give away any secrets, obviously, but it will hopefully be a diverse listening experience. And I also still plan to have a gaming news segment at the end where we can talk about some of the more major news stories to be addressed that don't exactly fall into any specific criteria or anything, but are important nonetheless. You know, they can do with some franchises, they can do with just like some like company in general, you know, but ultimately there is going to be news at the end. And lastly, I think that this will be a sort of a nice refreshing change of pace for those of you that have been following the show since the beginning, and this will give me the chance to make things a bit more personal regarding the channel. So I hope this all sounds interesting to you, because I am definitely ready to get started here. I briefly went over what kind of things are happening on the channel at the very beginning, but, you know, just to make a very brief summary of it, this is the halfway point of the year for Saving Progress podcast, the 6th ever episode out of hopefully 12 that will be released over the course of the entire year, as the show has had episodes being posted the first week of every month. And for those of you more observant types, you'll have already noticed that, but you know, hopefully this formula continues to be promising. Personally, I think it's been working out for me and my schedule pretty well, and lately I've noticed that I like posting them on Saturdays regardless of chronologically what day of the week it is. Like, for example, this week's episode is on the 2nd day of the first week. I know that sounds a bit confusing, but this is the kind of analysis that I have to go into regarding making a schedule. Nevertheless, I like where this is going, and I have no shortage of guests for the show, but, you know, that being said, if you think you'd be a good fit for the show and you have a lot to say about your favorite games, then feel free to send me a message over on Instagram or Twitter at Jump Higher Productions. That's at Jump Higher PROD, and we can discuss details from there. Lately, I get nothing but bots tagging me on free iPhone giveaways or trying to convince me to join their blockchain. So literally anything you send me will help break up the monotony that's been clogging my inbox. So in short, regarding the podcast, I like where the show is going. I have guests lined up. Once a month upload schedule is working out, and it's looking more and more like Saturday is going to be the most reliable day for uploading. So if you do have any questions, comments, or recommendations requiring the show, I definitely encourage you to leave a comment down below on this episode, or if you're listening elsewhere, shoot me a DM on the previously mentioned socials, Twitter, Instagram, @JumpHigherProductions. Those will be linked down below as well for your convenience. So otherwise, aside from the podcast, what videos do I have planned? Well, I'll have you know that the trailer for my latest video has been out for a little while. I managed to slap something together and uploaded it earlier this week. It's definitely going to be a Hollow Knight video in case that wasn't obvious enough, but I'm still working out the kinks regarding this new editing program that I've been trying to learn, and if all else fails or the process is just going too slowly, I'll probably just dump everything to the old program and get it finished up in that one. So, I don't want to go into too much detail about what it is or what the programs are that I'm using, but because I'm sure I'll have plenty to say about it on the next Dark Mode episode, but nonetheless, keep your eyes peeled for the next video. I don't have a day in mind for publishing it, just know that it will be uploaded by the end of the month. After that, I know I promised I would have another Mario Kart video out in my previous video analysis, so I will probably end up doing that after this Hollow Knight video, but as it stands, I wanted to shift into a new editing program, so if things start to look a little different, or in some cases not as high effort for a little while, now hopefully you understand why. I'm still going to try and maintain the highest level of quality I possibly can, but these kind of things are just worth being patient with, and in my case, it will hopefully solve a lot of the problems that were present in the previous program. So with all of that channel business out of the way, let's move on to the main topic at hand here. As you can see in the title, the topic of this episode is about exploring the idea of video games as an art form. Some of you may be familiar with this topic already, and some of you may consider it a dead horse that has since long been sufficiently beaten, but for those of you that aren't in the loop, this topic is actually pretty actively contested even to this day. I will admit there is basically a general consensus that has been reached by now, but until then there was and is a pretty staunch opposition on either side of the playing field, and those two sides are what I hope to get into with you today. Of course, I'll be sharing my thoughts and opinions as well, but what I don't want to do is try and convince people of thinking one way or another. I only want to express my thoughts, sometimes in a contradictory manner. Let's face it, mostly in a contradictory manner, but in order to facilitate this discussion, I kind of have to. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, as discussion generally goes, normally I would say the first thing that I think needs to be made clear is, what exactly makes something art? Unfortunately, this question, even in general, is something pretty hard to answer. Art as a concept is relatively difficult to explain, and even if I was able to give you a concrete answer, I would still get opposition because that is just the nature of art itself. It involves a lot of gray area, but that doesn't mean it can just be whatever someone wants it to be. What I can do, however, is give you the definition of art as defined by the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. And according to them, it is defined simply as the conscious use of the imagination in the production of objects intended to be contemplated or appreciated as beautiful, as in the arrangement of forms, sounds, or words. And on a similar note, dictionary.com defines art as, quote, the quality, production, expression, or realm, according to aesthetic principles, of what is beautiful, appealing, or of more than ordinary significance. I think it's pretty safe to say that both of those definitions, objectively speaking, are definitely true. In a literal sense, these definitions are correct. Going back to the dictionary.com definition, this implies that basically anything that is considered of more than ordinary significance can be considered art. And honestly, I have to agree, to an extent. But more on that later. By definition, can we apply video games to this description? Well, does it feature a conscious use of the imagination? Yeah, I'd say so. Is it intended to be contemplated or appreciated as beautiful? Some games certainly can be, yes. Is it in the arrangement of forms, sounds, or words, and can it be considered of more than ordinary significance? Most of the time it's all three, as a matter of fact, and many people would say that video games are much more interesting than many ordinary things. So, with all that being said, are video games considered art? Short answer, objectively speaking, yes. Long answer, well, it's complicated. Yes, video games can feature artistic expression within themselves, and many sources will tell you that they are legally protected as creative works by the Supreme Court of the United States, but those are all, to put it bluntly, technicalities. They are all responses to literal discussion and generally fall in line with objectivism. How can we prove that games are art to someone who isn't just looking for the dictionary definition? Someone who is fully immersed in the field, someone who has done nothing but devote themselves in their entire life to the field of art, and by some means considers themselves perhaps an art aficionado. Let's go ahead and get into the first side of this argument here. So for starters, I think it's safe to say that most people would think of art as being in a museum, right? Like, at least in some kind of art gallery. Well, it turns out that video games are in museums, as the literal, actual Smithsonian American Art Museum added both Flower, that one really artsy game developed by the company literally called That Game Company, and Halo 2600 as permanent exhibits within the museum. Halo 2600 is a very special case, to be fair, because it is actually a demake made by a single guy named Ed Freeze, who is a former employee of Microsoft. He went on to make this demake in the style of the Halo games for the Atari 2600, hence the name. He didn't really do it for any other reason outside of the fact that, one, he could, and two, he liked playing with the restriction of very limited and underpowered hardware such as the Atari 2600. Is that effort worth considering an artistic venture? Let's continue. On a similar note, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City has a bunch of video games on display, which started out as only 14 of them, but they claim to be aiming for roughly 40 historically important video games to display over the course of time, in their original playable format in order to celebrate gaming as an artistic medium. And the two games mentioned previously in the Smithsonian are two incredibly valid contenders for being considered art, but what kind of games are in the Modern Art Museum? Some of these games might actually surprise you, but there are a few obvious outstanders such as Pong, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Tetris, including an actual Magnavox Odyssey on display, which, for those of you that don't know, the Magnavox Odyssey is considered the first ever commercial home video game console. And some of the other games on the list, however, are very conventionally artsy games such as Flow and Passage, two games that some would consider are pioneers of the video games as art movement, one of them having also been developed by the previously mentioned That Game Company. But there are also titles like Street Fighter II, Katamari Damacy, Portal, and even Minecraft on the list. And not only that, but the games themselves are displayed in a minimalist environment in an effort to prevent nostalgia from influencing the actual gameplay experience in any way. And there are several other instances of video games on display in various exhibits, but I believe these two already succeed at proving this point. And so, now that we've established that, according to professionals running legitimate museums, video games can sit alongside both modern and traditional art, at this time, I think that it's necessary to list the things that most people, like you and I, would consider quantifiable evidence that video games possess artistic value. And I think the biggest thing to point out is that video games can be an amalgamation of many different art forms. You have 2D art, you have 3D art, narrative storytelling, to just name a few. But not every game includes one of these things, As a matter of fact, there are games that I mentioned previously that have no spoken words or any words at all throughout the duration of gameplay outside of the credits. There is also art on the boxes of the physical copies of games, and there are soundtracks that can be listened to outside of the context of the games by themselves. Another thing that should be mentioned is that art usually has multiple meanings to certain people, feelings that can only be achieved through viewing a specific medium or experiencing something a specific way. Video games, in my opinion, achieve that function pretty well. Yes, the story can be concrete and have a finite end, but does that automatically discredit everything the game can exemplify? I mean, is it wrong of me to ask that if someone else's experience of a game doesn't reflect someone else's, does that really affect the overall integrity of the game itself? To most people on the outside looking into this discussion, it would be safe to say that through this collection of what can only be considered art pieces on their own, this automatically categorizes video games as an art form itself. I mean, you can't have something that contains art not be intrinsically artistic, right? And every piece of art that's included in the game has an artist behind it, along with a medium, an atelier, a design/composition, and a genre. So what out there can possibly make this topic so contested, even to this day? Well, before I get into some of the more major counter-arguments, one thing that I would like you to remember going forward is that I mentioned that this proves that video games contain artistic value, and that it does not qualify it as art. That being said, I guess that also means I kind of have to state my thoughts on art in general. You know, what is the purpose of art, and what is art considered to me? And before you go on and quote me as some kind of expert, I'll stop you right now by saying I'm not, by any means, a professional. I did not go to school for art, nor do I really consider myself an artist outside of the literal sense. You know, I listen, I create, and I think about art on a daily basis, but that does not qualify me more than it does you. I also mentioned previously that this is only for the sake of creating discussion, and that basically what I feel is not the end-all be-all of this entire argument. And with that out of the way, my definition of art is honestly a simple one. You know, I believe the true purpose of any art is to evoke emotion. And regardless of the artist's intention or its perceived interpretation, as long as the art has attracted someone and brought forth some kind of response, the art has done its job, so to speak. You know, it could be for a serious reason, like advocating for a cause or change in society, or to simply provide just low-brow humor and be forgotten about within a few minutes. You know, sometimes it could even represent nothing at all, or maybe the artist's intention is unclear or forced by someone else even, but even if it does lack true meaning, I believe that this is still valid grounds for something to be considered art. And I realize that by this definition, of course, anything could be considered art, because as long as a human being exercised its humanity by producing it somewhere along the line, it can be considered art. Even if a machine were to perform an exact replica of a painting done by a person, if another person built that machine and input the code to tell it to replicate said painting, that is still, to me, an art form in some way. So where do video games line up according to that? Well, by my definition, of course they're art. They evoke more emotion in me than most other things I can think of off the top of my head. However, even if I did go around and point at every little thing in my room right now, I could still name how that thing makes me feel and what thoughts I have in response to it. And because of that, in turn, those things could all be considered art. Some of the things do contain more artistic merit than others, of course, like a drawing or a signed poster has way more significance to me than a chair, but it is all still valid in a similar way. Now that you know that about me, let's go ahead and look at some of the more prominent anti-video games as art opinions that we can reflect on in this episode. And just to make things interesting, I only have basic outlines written in response to these arguments, and with those, I'm simply going to give my honest thoughts and counterpoints regarding these critiques. I'm going to be completely transparent here. Most of these arguments are from some of the more popular points that have been made, So, don't go thinking that these are going to be like some from extraneous deep dive that I've conducted or anything. You may have heard some of these in the past if you've followed this topic before, but, I wanted to use opinions that have garnered at least some kind of public spotlight. Like, I don't want to discredit someone that can obviously be proven wrong or doesn't know what they're talking about, so their points may not be as valid. I want to take proper criticism and apply my own thoughts to it, just so that I can see where you might stand on this matter and can possibly let me know your thoughts in that moment. Possibly in the comments, possibly in a DM, who knows? It could be either one of those. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The first example that I have here ties into this point that, what makes this stand out so much lies within the fact that art usually faces criticism as it's brought into popularity. Critics of established media are usually the ones who can provide an actual opinion on new forms of art. And this is a concept that ties into stuff from way back in the day, like when Picasso was first making art or when Van Gogh was creating things. Van Gogh specifically didn't receive the reputation that he has today until after he died. And of course, leading up to his death, he did receive praise, but he also received plenty of criticism. So where am I going with this? Well, back in the mid-2000s, a film critic by the name of Roger Ebert, I'm going to say Ebert for convenience sake, but Roger Ebert provided some of the most notable examples of this anti-movement against video games as an art form. He is quoted on Wikipedia, very reliable source, as saying the following: "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic." Well, we already know that this is bullshit, mainly from the fact that Shadow of the Colossus also came out in 2005, but moving on. I'll get back to that one, I promise. But later on, he made another note on why video games can't be art, and that's that video games present this form of malleability that would otherwise ruin other forms of art. He then goes on to compare this to changing the ending to Romeo and Juliet, implying that doing so would ruin the artistic expression of the entire work. Later on in 2010, he then goes on to write a full-on actual essay discrediting a presentation that Kelly Santiago, one of the founders of that game company, there it is, yet again being brought up, and he is quoted again as follows: "One obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Santiago might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say then it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, dance, a film. Those are things you cannot win. You can only experience them." So, what are my thoughts on this guy? Well, I would like to point out that this guy later on went back on his word after, I shit you not, actually playing a game and enjoying it. Who would have thought that actually playing games could change your opinion on a few things? He admitted he didn't know much about the field at the time, and that games may indeed be art in a non-traditional sense, and that the game that he ended up playing was Cosmology of Kyoto, which is a point-and-click adventure game that takes place in Japan and lacks an overall true narrative. The game supposedly encourages exploration and gives players the freedom to go on and discover everything that the game has to offer within its own little world, sometimes having you pick out text opinions and even typing out sentences. And if any game were to work, I think that ended up being a pretty great example, actually, to showcase the level of immersion that games really are capable of, even back then. So going back to the first opinion that was shared, where in the first quote he said video games cannot be compared to the greatest works of art from poets and filmmakers, I think nowadays that claim kind of speaks for itself. Ultimately, however, I think that saying every modern game stands up to the greats is pretty narrow-minded. We don't have generations of people over hundreds of years looking at, I don't know, God of War and going, yep, that's a good game. Right now, video games cannot fathom the influence the greats have right now, so to speak. But, if you're talking visual experiences, then goddamn, look at any modern PlayStation exclusive. Like, those alone can stand up to this claim. Within the first hour of gameplay, you're hardly pressing any buttons. You're just barely dipping your toes into this story that the game depends so heavily on. I had already mentioned Shadow of the Colossus previously, which if you haven't played yet, I strongly recommend you do so. It's just one of the best examples of telling a story with very little dialogue and very little player incentive for that matter, and the HD remasters just look amazing, even on PS4. So, getting back on track here, when it comes to the comparison thing, it is true that most people who stir up this argument rarely have an example to refute that point, myself included, but that doesn't discredit games as art entirely. However, when he goes on to say video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to ourselves, isn't it only fair to say that virtually anything we do can be considered a waste of time, especially in the art field, as much as I hate to admit it? Sure, I can play a game and I can either tweet about it and move on with my life, or I can choose to make a video about it, which I would personally consider to be one of the most productive solutions for myself. Also, what really is time not wasted? You can go on and talk about being cultured and civilized and this and that, but nowadays, realistically, what can a movie give you that a video game cannot? Even something simple like Pac-Man can take up as much time as a movie, and to many people, all of these things could be considered unproductive at best. So to use that as a discredit for artistic integrity is honestly a bit nonsensical, really. But moving on, the idea of malleability, this claim that introducing interactivity automatically discredits the original work. This is something you'll see pops up in a lot of these arguments. So because it does, I'm going to save a majority of my thoughts on that for later. But what makes Ebert's argument a little different from the others is his claim that it would otherwise weaken the artistic expression. In his example, he uses Romeo and Juliet's ending and in layman's terms says it just wouldn't be the same. And to be honest, yeah, he would be right about that. It wouldn't be the same. It's got a different ending. How can it possibly convey the same intention? However, what this doesn't do is remove the artistic expression. Regardless of how the story is told, if the original is to be considered art, then any subsequent changes made to the plot don't really discredit the ability of it being considered art. The other thing that he says, however, holds a little bit more merit. I'm rephrasing a bit, but he says that a huge difference between art and video games is that games can be won, and that anything short of having a win condition or points or whatever ceases to be a game and is instead an experience, like a film or a novel. Again, he is not wrong, but he unfortunately, in my opinion, he just falls short of this point he was trying to make. Like, when you have a game, regardless of if it has points or rules, it's always going to have some kind of barrier to accessibility. So, in other words, you almost always have to have some prior understanding to go into any kind of experience. You can't have a baby play a video game and expect them to get very far, but they also cannot experience art in the same way that we do. There are physical barriers there, such as the ability to see or read or anything along those lines, but there is also language and cultural understanding. Interacting in any way with anything requires at least some of these things. My question to you is, does having one of those missing inherently affect the integrity of the work of art? Is it any less to one person just because another cannot read what it says? How about to the artist? Does their intention or reasoning behind it change? What's to say that just because there is a win and lose condition that the experience is muddied in any way? If there is a game that never ends until you walk away from the screen, how is that any different from viewing a painting? Both were crafted with the intention of experiencing something, yet one is being prioritized over another. In a similar sense, you could say that there is merit in any experience, regardless of whether it's considered an ideal one or not. Just because a baby cannot identify the artistic integrity of the work does not mean that their interpretation of it is any less than ours. And I believe picking and choosing one over the other is, to put it simply, not fair and a bit trivializing. However, it's easy for someone who has no real experience with games to criticize them, but little do we know that game developers themselves have also contributed to this precedent that Roger Ebert had set, which includes names such as Brian Moriarty, who was responsible for several Infocom interactive titles, and even Hideo Kojima, who you guys might know him as the guy in charge of the Metal Gear series and more recently Death Stranding, which are two series that are convoluted in their own sense. But anyways, Moriarty in 2011 went on to stress that video games are more or less in the same vein as traditional games, such that there has never been any real call to declare games like chess or any other board game to be considered art, implying that video games do not deserve the kind of attention this argument has been getting. He also stresses the idea that video games, as well as many other forms of media, including movies, are low art at best, in this case meaning of little aesthetic value, and that they will never compare to what sublime art, or what he considers real art, can represent. Rewind a bit back to 2006, when Kojima basically went on to say that games may contain artwork, but once the interactivity is introduced, the artistic integrity is lost. He compared it to driving a car. As long as the car has artistic features about it, it can be considered art. However, once 100 people drive it, that's 100 different experiences that reflect on this car now. He also goes on to say that from a business standpoint, the purpose of a video game is to achieve 100% player satisfaction, whereas art does not necessarily have to be targeted towards anyone. And for that reason, video game creation is more of a service than an artistic endeavor. He also compares himself to an owner of a museum, where people may go inside the museum to enjoy the artwork within it, but that he himself is running the museum, but also providing the artwork inside. So let's go ahead and stop there for a second and talk about all that. I mean, of course, there's a lot to be said about Kojima's words, but let's go back to what Moriarty said. There has been no real call for games like chess to be considered art. In preparation for this, I went ahead and read his whole entire lecture, and let me tell you, it really does feel like a lecture, but there's one point in the entire thing where he tries to make an example out of the listener by creating this pseudo video game that features elements from various highly regarded forms of media. He takes that and he puts it all into one simple animation and then calls it a game. And at this point, he goes on to say this: the identity of a game emerges from its mechanics and affordances, not the presentation that exposes them. But can an arrangement of mechanics and affordances, rules and goals, itself constitute a work of art? To which, at that point, I would say, yes, of course it does. But then he goes on and says, before you scream yes, explain to me why chess is not regarded as a work of art. And to me, that just doesn't really come across as very fair, because what he's doing is he's attempting to spin the question back on the listener in order to just confuse them. Like, it's trying to get the listener to define art, which I've already explained earlier is tricky at best and, quite frankly, impossible at worst. And he also implies that there even is a specific reason that chess is not considered art, and to whom, you may ask? Honestly, I couldn't tell you if anyone ever came out and said it couldn't be, aside from this guy. You know, he even says himself in his research of 25 years of philosophy, anytime sports or games are mentioned at all, they're dismissed as a pastime, harmless at best, an evil destroyer of youth in the worst. So for him to ask me to define it is pretty ridiculous when no one else has really bothered to say otherwise. So where am I going to pull it from? I don't know. But the fact is, honestly, like, the fact that this little quote-unquote game even has to exist kind of proves my point. The irony alone present in the performance of this piece has much more value than anything he's trying to refute. The parody that he has made, consisting of all these individual parts, all from recognizable forms of media, this makes a statement on the world of art in general and what it really means to define art, but not in the way he thinks it does. Its presentation alone solidifies its identity, and the addition of rules and goals would not change that. The fact that it is not a real game has nothing to do with it, because including an interactive portion of it would only serve to solidify the point even further. By doing this, he has made himself into an artist, even if he may not consider himself one, kind of like Kojima. And by doing that, he has successfully produced art, which he himself has also referred to as a game. And so, the other thing that he mentions is that video games are low art and that they'll never be quote-unquote high art, or whatever he said. All this means is that he sees one piece of art as better than another just because it can represent something and have ambiguous meanings. And honestly, I don't see how a game can't have that same description applied to it. Going back to my response to Ebert about the generations and generations of people approving of it, that's the only real thing stopping it from being on the same level on a materialistic standpoint. But as it stands right now, objectively speaking, they are the same. Does chess not influence generations of people in the same way a work of art can? If the game itself is not art, then why is chess featured in so many older artworks? Do we have to experience chess by playing it? Or can we feel something just by watching someone else play? Something can be said about the technique and mastery behind certain chess moves and strategies, and performing said actions can elicit a variety of reactions, not too far and away from how Let's Players can create reactions within a Twitch stream, or even how a professional player does in esports. There is intuition in how a game is being played, and just because one form of art has a win condition does not mean anything. The game itself can mean many things to people, and in turn, it serves to provide niche judgment, just like quote-unquote high art does. Again, going back to what I said in my own simplified definition of art, some things do have more artistic merit than others, but there's probably many more people out there that give way more of a damn about whatever game is being talked about than some painting that he decides to mention. So, my question is, does that make it art? Well, let's continue. Now that we've gone ahead and gotten that out of the way, let's move on to what Kojima had to say. He said that games may contain artwork that stands on its own, which is something that both Ebert and Moriarty had said as well. But once the interactivity is introduced, the artistic integrity is lost. He compared to driving it to a car. As long as the car has artistic features about it, it can be considered art. But once 100 people drive it, that's 100 different experiences that reflect on this car. And so, for the sake of continuing the argument, I'm going to just assume that whatever he's saying is not as simple as the physical product is being changed, because obviously if the car hasn't changed, then as long as the car was previously considered to have some sort of artistic merit behind it, then that merit is likely still there. I mean, unless they got in like an accident and completely changed the shape, it's still the same car. Yeah, the opinion can change on the car once it is driven, but I'm pretty sure in the end, you can still agree the car is still the same car. This is where I'd like to continue off of what I had to say in regards to Ebert's argument. And this isn't exactly what Kojima said, but there is another argument to be had that states that once changes are introduced, the person that made the art, they are no longer the artist, and that you, at that point, become the artist. And to be honest, I don't really believe this is true, simply because I feel like people attach themselves to the game portion of video games too much, and that the main objective of a game is to do what the game tells you to do. If a chef walks over and sets a just beautiful burger down in front of you and then tells you to eat it, is the art in that burger lost in that moment? Is there no artistic merit in the food being presented so masterfully that it's transcending this primal need to just eat so your stomach stops rumbling? Like, at that point, is it no longer a work of art once the objective is made clear to eat it? Why do we feel the need to categorize games in this way as well? Like, just because there is a preconceived idea that, yes, you have to play the game the way the developer intended it, otherwise you're not getting the intended experience, does that really affect the overall artistic impression of the game? I personally don't think so. Objectively speaking, that game still exists in its own right, regardless of who plays it. Kojima also goes on to say that the purpose of a video game is to achieve 100% player satisfaction, whereas art does not necessarily have to be targeted towards anyone, and for that reason, video game creation is much more of a service than an artistic endeavor. He also compares himself to an owner of a museum, where people may go inside the museum to enjoy the artwork within it, but that he himself is running the museum, but also providing the artwork inside. And my question to all of this now is, are you an artist or not, Kojima? Like, if you're the one that's putting the stuff in the museum, regardless of your intentions, people are still going to look at it. Although, in a way, I mean, he is right. From a business perspective, the purpose of the game is to make as much money as possible, whereas most art does not need to meet that requirement. Lots of people have said this before, and also, just to throw a wrench into things, what's not to say that the museum itself can be a work of art? I even went and Googled it, and I couldn't find a single result. So, am I just not asking the right questions, or is it just something that people don't really consider? However, despite all that, in a way, he is right. From a business perspective, the purpose of a game is to make as much money as possible, whereas most art does not need to meet that requirement. Lots of people have said this before, and people like to claim that because the video game industry is tarnished by commercialism, that for that reason it will never be considered as an art form. Cool. Okay, so are movies not eligible to be art then as well? Because I can assure you, most people in the movie industry would agree that their main concern is obtaining as much money from their product as possible. Just because the most popular movies and games are the ones that make the most money, that does not mean that the rest of the media is disqualified. Indie games are a prime example of what can be done when there aren't 100 or so employees with families to be responsible for, but even their games do not speak for the genre as a whole. There are plenty of games that haven't even been made yet that will eventually transcend what we know about video games today. And I feel like at that point, we will really understand what is considered art in this capacity. So on that note, I think we can stop the discussion there and get into, what are the closing thoughts? For starters, I think that what we need to understand as consumers is that we don't necessarily need these things. We don't need art. But why do we always find ourselves coming back to it? In a way, maybe we do need it. We need it so that we can learn to love the life that we've been given, so that our main focuses are not solely on survival. That being said, what can be said about the future of games as an art form? Honestly, sky's the limit. Until we get a Starry Night or a Mona Lisa of video games, I think that it will continue to be contested. However, what I said in the beginning is that there is, in fact, a general consensus that has been achieved. Based on everything you've heard, what can you guess? Well, if you guess that it can be considered art, then you would be correct, and a good listener. Good job. But I do want to reiterate that my word does not dictate the rules of art, nor does it dictate anything for that matter outside of my own opinions. But the discussion right now, considering the fact that there are video games in literal museums, the discussion is not if it is art or not, but rather what kind of art it is. And that is where I will leave this topic at. We now turn our attention to the gaming news portion of the podcast, and today's episode is going to be a little bit interesting, solely because of the fact that I have to bounce all of this news off of myself and share all of my own thoughts on it. Nonetheless, I still think that these are very important topics to share, especially considering that these things are happening currently, like right now in the gaming sphere. Like, you may not have even heard of some of these topics yet, but they are worth mentioning. So let's start off with the thing that I feel like I have the most to say about, the fact that there was a new trailer revealed for the Breath of the Wild sequel, which finally shows a little bit more of the lore involved with this installment, including a little bit about Link and the Master Sword's current states. And I know some of you are trying to avoid spoilers about the game, but I just want to make it clear that, I mean, in my opinion, there's no real spoiler in the video itself, but rather in the speculation involving the game surrounding it. So, like, I feel like you'd be okay looking at the video, but if you pay attention to what people are saying about the video, that's where you can run into trouble. So I suppose if you really don't want to know what the game looks like, then you can just continue to avoid it by all means. But if you do want to see it for yourself, head on over to my Twitter where I posted a response to the announcement, and you can hear my thoughts there. Until then, I also have to include that, sadly, along with this reveal, came the news that we will unfortunately have to wait even longer for a sequel than we initially anticipated. And this is not the first time this game has been delayed, and some might say there is a chance that it's not the last either, but we, as Zelda fans, I feel, can only just continue to hold out hope. I mean, you saw that haircut. Like, how can you not trust someone with a haircut like that? Come on. And normally this is where I would jump in and deliver the classic Shigeru Miyamoto quote that I always love spouting, the one that involves delayed games still having the potential to be good, while rushed games are forever bad. And even though I technically just did, I think my world was flipped a bit upside down when I found out recently that this quote actually didn't come from him at all. Yeah, a bit surprising, I know, but what's more surprising is that actually we don't know where it came from. It was brought to my attention, not the quote, but this news here. It was brought to my attention through a little channel called Spawnwave. You may have heard of it, like 500,000 subscribers, not that many, but more specifically, the channel Spawnwave Plus, where he goes into detail describing a Twitter thread made by a guy named Ethan Johnson, where he responds to a tweet where someone was asking for the origins of the supposed Miyamoto quote, betting $100 that it cannot be found. So from there, Johnson goes on to make a series of replies that sort of archive his digging that he's been doing regarding this mystery, explaining what he thinks led to the misattribution of what is generally considered to just be a lone quote from the industry itself to Nintendo and Miyamoto more specifically. I'll, of course, leave a link in the description for anyone interested in watching this video or reading the thread themselves, but ultimately on the second or third conclusion, Johnson states that in Next Generation magazine, from an article in June 1998's edition, that the author of the article claims the quote was posted on a wall at a development house, while also talking about the delays that Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time faced. It's kind of hard to know exactly what this author meant. Was it a Nintendo house that had the quote, or were they just referencing this quote that was found somewhere else, but just happened to be mentioned in the context of talking about Ocarina of Time? And who knows? And honestly, all in all, what does this mean for me and my usage of the quote? let's bring it back on me. Let's talk about me. But I recognize its oversaturation in the field and how often people tend to use it every time a game is delayed, especially a Nintendo one. But honestly, even if I stop using the quote, it's hard to argue the point that it makes. Take, for example, No Man's Sky. That's a game that promised a lot of things. And from my understanding, there were some unfortunate things that happened during the development cycle, but ultimately it was released to a rather negative reception. Not because the game was inherently bad, but it did not live up to its promises nearly as much as people were expecting it to. And so from then on, this game has had a negative reception attached to it, regardless of if it's actually a good game now or not. An even better example, I should say, is Fallout 76. In the episode with Steve and I, and if you haven't checked out that episode of Saving Progress, definitely do so, even he admitted that the game is serviceable now, and dare I say, even enjoyable to play. But back then, it was considered nothing short of a nightmare scenario for everyone involved in it, consumers and developers alike. So, what is this quote really trying to convey? Outside of annoying people on Twitter every single time it's brought up, what is it trying to say? A game is only really late until it is released. Then it's no longer late, and future generations will likely not care that it was late. For example, Ocarina of Time. But if it's released unfinished, then the game will live on with this tarnished reputation even after several months of patches fixing it. Maybe long after that, people will forget, but that's only if people stop referring to it as a game that failed at launch. So, does it really matter that Miyamoto didn't say it? No, it doesn't. But it does still serve a valuable lesson, and it should not be used as an excuse to tell others to suck it up and deal with it if their favorite game series is delayed, but rather as an understanding of the workings behind video game development and the providing of a different perspective. And speaking of games that take forever to release, the 20th anniversary of Kingdom Hearts just recently took place. On March 28th, 2002 was when the very first Kingdom Hearts game was released, and there have been lots of things to look at on top of some exciting news coming up soon regarding the franchise. So for starters, let's take a look back at some of the more memorable things to happen recently to the franchise. So of course, you have Sora's edition of Smash Bros. Literally breaking the internet once again due to the sheer power that Smash Bros. DLC held over us. I, of course, was a huge fan of this decision, as he had been my number one pick for every single game leading up to Ultimate. I mean, scroll back to my first video, you'll see exactly what sparked the video being made, But besides that, people outside of the fandom may not actually know that Tokyo Disney had a hotel room that can be rented out in celebration of the franchise's 20th anniversary. And the only reason I don't specify if it's still there or not is because they said it's going to be available until April. So this could mean that it's technically still there, just not rentable. It could be completely gone. Regardless, this is good news for someone like me who has thought that Disney had been ignoring Kingdom Hearts for some time, especially at its parks. I mean, I actually just recently got my hands on some Kingdom Hearts pins from Disneyland, and anyone that knows Disney parks knows how big of a deal these pins are. I personally really like them, and they're going right next to my other pins from the deluxe editions of the games. But the funny thing about this hotel room, though, is that inside is a treasure chest that claims there is a secret inside that no pictures are to be posted of until April 28th of 2022. People have been making all sorts of jokes like, oh, anything that involves Kingdom Hearts in some capacity is going to be tied into the lore because Nomura is just insane. But what I'm thinking of is considering the fact that there is supposed to be a full-blown 20th anniversary event happening on April 10th in Tokyo, you can only help but wonder what the dates have to do with each other. Maybe the contents have a hint related to the upcoming sequel. Maybe it's just something else. I don't know. Of course, because it's the age of the internet, you can actually look up what the contents are because guests are supposedly allowed to talk about what's inside. They're just not allowed to share photos. So even so, the contents offer an air of mystery to the entire thing. It's not necessarily a spoiler for anything, and if you care to know and don't want to wait until the 28th, I'll be sure to leave a link in the description. But other than that little mystery, people aren't really expecting any extravagant announcement at the event. But the consensus is, damn, it would be really nice to have one, just because of the track record for Kingdom Hearts taking forever. But the event is reported to consist of a mini concert, a live Q&A chat with the development team, and some sort of exhibition. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know if anyone knows what it is, but Square Enix also confirmed that the show will not be live streamed, but a video will come after the fact. So in the meantime, until this event happens, we can take a look at some really cool celebratory art that has been shared by Tetsuya Nomura himself, Square Enix, regarding their Final Fantasy franchise, and even Masahiro Sakurai paying homage to the franchise's history and the impact it has had on so many lives. Check my Twitter account for those pictures, as I have just recently retweeted those. But after you do that, you can take a look at the official Tamagotchi being released for the 20th anniversary. Not much to say about those. You can you can have Sora and Kairi as pets, and I tried visiting the website to find a link to these Tamagotchi, but despite every attempt I made at obtaining a proper web page, this has led me to believe that these are just unobtainable outside of Japan. I could be wrong, but honestly, I don't really care about these things. I understand the Tamagotchi, like, they're still a big deal in Japan, so, more power to them, but I think I'll pass. I got better stuff to buy. I feel like I could spend that money elsewhere. But lastly, on the topic of games that have their home on the PlayStation series, Sony has also just recently unveiled the brand new PlayStation Plus subscription service that goes into effect starting in June. Basically, what they have going on here are 3 new optional services that are different based on how much content you'd like to have. Realistically, only 2 of them are actually new, but let's get into that. The 3 different membership tiers are as follows: Essential, Extra, and Premium. Essential is basically the membership that we have currently, so no changes there. But the next 2 tiers, Extra and Premium, offer much more than what the current subscription does. So for those of you that may not have a PlayStation or may not already have PlayStation Plus, what you currently get for $60 a year is 2 monthly downloadable games at no extra cost, exclusive discounts in the PlayStation Store, cloud storage for save game data, and access to online multiplayer. Pretty straightforward if I do say so myself, but the catch here is that you don't get to choose what games you get. They're picked seemingly at random by Sony or some other party, and all of the games you do get through it are inaccessible without a membership. So in other words, if you cancel your membership, you lose access to all these games, even if you have them downloaded and saved to your library. You also can't access your backed up save data, and you'll be restricted on many of the online services PlayStation has to offer. So as long as you keep paying for it, you're good. But what is good is that if you do decide to cancel and then join at a later time, like, you can still re-access those things. Like, they don't technically go anywhere. It's just that there's like a wall that prevents you from accessing it if you don't have the membership. So, it's whatever. It's just the nature of subscription services and whatever. Anyways, moving on to the extra tier for $100 a year. This gives you everything that the essential tier does, but also up to 400 additional PS4 and PS5 games, including third-party titles. And games in the extra tier are downloadable for play and will be compatible with online multiplayer. So 400 extra games, not a bad deal. But finally, the premium tier, Sony's most expensive tier, for $120 a year, gives you everything that the previous 2 tiers offer, along with 340 more games in addition to the 400 from earlier. This number includes many PS3 titles available to play via cloud streaming, as well as various PS1, PS2, and even PSP games that can be streamed or downloaded. And on top of that, premium members will also be able to try out a game before buying it. So not only are you getting close to 800 games to play around with, you're essentially getting unlimited free trials to games you may or may not want to buy ahead of time, on top of everything you're already getting. And I will admit the price is steep, but it does seem worth it for those of you who are dying to get through a serious PlayStation saturated backlog. So the only game that I would really be interested in playing right now is Legend of Dragoon, which is a PlayStation 1 exclusive, and I haven't been able to play it in such a long time, but I could always try and dust off a PS1 in the meantime until June, but we'll see about that. But another thing worth mentioning is that Sony is also getting rid of the PlayStation Now service, which allowed cloud streaming of a ton of games for a fixed monthly price. But I honestly don't know a single person that used that service, solely for the fact that games, plain and simple, run much better natively on the console than they probably ever will while being streamed. What's nice, though, is that anyone with a PS Now subscription will automatically get transferred over to the premium tier subscription, so they likely won't have to change anything about their playing habits, but the things that people online are saying about this service, though, they just think it's funny that PS3 games can't be emulated on the consoles. Like, they're basically just saying, like, my guy, like, you made the console. Why is it so difficult for you of all companies, But, I mean, if you look at any interview or just, like, numbers or whatever, like, you'll see that the PlayStation 3 development kit was just notoriously difficult to work with. So when they didn't want to do it for PS3, they just went over to Xbox 360 and just stuck with it from there. Like, I'm just glad that nothing changes for me personally, because there's no way I'm going to go for that significant of an upgrade until I see some kind of reception in the future. Maybe at some point I'll upgrade, like maybe only for a single year as a one-off thing, but ultimately I think I'll stick with my current plan. I like my cloud data backup. I like my 2 games a month. I'll keep going with that until I get sick of it, or until I just really want to play Legend of Dragoon. But anyways, one more piece of news for you guys before I close this whole thing off is that E3 2022, the digital event, was officially reported as being canceled. As much as it felt like an April Fool's joke to hear at first, unfortunately, this means no physical convention this year and no digital one either. And this comes as a surprise to a lot of people considering the hype that generates around E3 every year, but honestly, there will be more than enough showcases from individual companies to broadcast their announcements and news later this summer, so me personally, I'm not too worried about it, to be honest. You got your Nintendo Directs. I'm sure Ubisoft is going to have something. Who knows? Maybe we'll see the comeback of Verizon talking about gaming, but the ESA has stated, however, that E3 will return in 2023 with, quote, a reinvigorated showcase. Only time will tell for that one. But until then, that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end if you did. I hope you were able to enjoy this change of pace regarding the podcast. I know it was different, and albeit a little weird, but hopefully we'll have a regular interview-style episode again starting next month. But for now, guys, be sure to subscribe to the channel for any upcoming episodes, and if you have any questions you'd like me to answer or have some recommendations for the next episode, feel free to leave a comment down below or message me on Instagram or Twitter at Jump Higher Productions. That's Jump Higher PROD. We'll be back next time when we find someone that we can dive deep into the discussion with, and hopefully we can continue to share our personal connections to video games with you all. So thanks for listening, and bye for now.